Can we talk about World War II in the Soviet Union?
Sure.
So on Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, which was the surprise invasion of the Soviet Union.
Right.
If I could read to you a few lyrics from a song that for some reason has stuck throughout my childhood. It was a famous song during that time. 22 июня, ровно в 4 часа, Киев бомбили, нам объявили, что началась война. Война началась на рассвете, чтобы больше народу убить. Спали родители, спали их дети, когда стали Киев бомбить. The song talks about Kiev, like that moment as part of that operation that Kiev was first bombed, and it was announced on June 22nd. The song says at exactly 4 o'clock that the war has begun. For some reason, this song haunts me because the exactness of that time and this realization that at any moment you can have this thing happen to you in your own personal life. Maybe we had something like 9/11 happen where everything changes. And it's just like haunting because it makes me think that at any moment something like that could happen that changes everything. And I just think about like normal life going on in Kiev at the time, and then all of a sudden the bombs are dropping and they announce that the war has begun, and you thought you were going to stay out of the war.
This is something that is very intensely emotional for me because you and I are both Russian Jewish. So to know that my grandparents and my great grandma were told that the Nazis are coming, and this wasn't a dress rehearsal, and that if they get here, which they do, they did. Lvov is very Western Ukraine. That 100% you and all your relatives are going to be murdered.
Yeah.
And there's a monument now in Lvov where I'm from about this, but I don't think either of us can imagine what it's like to think that we're about, minutes or whatever, hours, or there's just the Russian army standing between us and everyone we are related to are going to be murdered for no reason. And like, what's the closure here, right? Like, they evacuated a lot of people, but they didn't evacuate enough. And to know that there is this force coming to 100% murder you. This isn't some kind of, the TV news being hyperbolic. They are coming to kill you. And if they get you, they will kill you. And you have to, we all think about war like, we hope America wins in Iraq, rah, rah. But if America got their ass kicked kind of in Vietnam, it's not really going to affect America in the sense that you're going to have the body bags and all the kids being killed. And that's something I'm not sweeping under the rug. But no one in America thought the Vietnamese are going to come here and kill them, right? They were secure in their person. So to have that sense of, we really need to win, because if we don't win, we are 100%, the Russian army doesn't win, we are 100% all going to be slaughtered, and often in not just a bullet to the head in sadistic ways, is something that to know that people who share my blood saw and went through is very hard for me to kind of wrap my head around.
And there's no possibility to delude yourself.
Yeah.
Because, they would, as the song also talks about, but they would burn the factories. So it's basically saying, we're in the war now. This is
your life. Yeah. Like,
this is our life now.
You know how yesterday you were worried about, like, I misplaced my pen. Where is it? Like, it's like, this was paradise.
Most of us are our life now is that most of us are going to die. And if we want to prevent all of us from dying, we have to fight.
And we also can't sit down in some kind of weird, like, desert island or, plane crash situation and be like, let's decide between us who's going to be the first to die. Maybe like the Titanic, right?
Hmm.
They sat down and they were like women and children in the lifeboats. They had this rational agreement. You don't have those choices in a war. So, it's something that it's just very chilling, and it's something I don't really have um, the emotional space to understand or grapple with. Even obviously, I've been to North Korea. You can see it, and so on and so forth. Uh, you and I can't, or anyone listening to this, except for maybe on me and people like that, you can't imagine what that's like to live it. We can't. We can't imagine what it's like to live in those situations where it's not like before Hitler came, everyone's dancing around and having a great time. I mean, imagine what that life is like, where your preference to Hitler is starving and waiting online for hours for bread, and to have the secret police and your friends are turning you in and your phones are all tapped and you're a prisoner. But to you, this is infinitely better than the alternative. Like, these are the choices that our family had to deal with. It's something that no matter how much it's like let me put it in terms people can understand. You know what I mean? It's like your first bad breakup, right?
Hmm.
Like, that's a much simpler thing to wrap your head around, because it's like, if you've never had it, you can't really, but when you feel it, it's so intense, but you can't tell someone what's like. We could sit down for days and hours and have people tell us, but until it's the totality of your environment and your life and your mindset. I remember my grandma, um, she would talk about it like, when you're that hungry, all, all you're thinking about is bread,
Yeah.
because your brain won't let human beings. We evolved, we have instincts, whatever, and the mind is telling you food, food, food,
Yeah.
food, 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 and that there's kids thinking this, and that they're not going to get the food.
Yeah.
And you imagine being a parent and your kids.
Watching your kids without food and knowing they're not going to get the food.
And the fact that this happened in North Korea in the 90s,
Yeah.
I met a refugee, and he had to watch his dad starve to death. And thank you. And we have no concept of what it's like. I mean, we kind of, it's just like last night here in Austin, all the places were closed and I couldn't get my protein powder.
Yeah.
And this is the extent of my suffering when it comes to food. Or if I couldn't, there was a restaurant that I went to in Brooklyn where, for some fakakta reason, they weren't serving sashimi, they only had sushi. So I had to have the rice and the carbs. To live a life where that is the extent of your food problems, as opposed to the choice is either Hitler killing you or being hungry 24/7. My grandma told this story of how they had a close call. It was her and her brother and her mom, my great grandma, who passed. And I think there was like either a helicopter overhead or something. And my great grandma jumped on top of my grandma's brother and not my grandma. So she basically did a Sophie's choice. My grandma's name is Sophia, and chose the brother. And this is something that she felt, all her life, that her mom had chosen her brother over her. But these little things that happen, these little kind of decisions we have to make in war. There's a book I read called Five Chimneys, I think. This woman who was an Auschwitz survivor. And what she talked about, what people don't appreciate, it's not necessarily the slaughter and the torture. It's that there's no rhyme or reason to it. Yeah. Like, she talked about how they had a camp just for people from Czechoslovakia, and they were treated better than the Jews. And then one day they just killed them all, right? And she's like, I still don't understand why they're giving them food and treating them well, and then the next day they're all killed, and we will never get answers, And she's and things like, she talks about how they decided to kill all the kids, and they didn't really, either for some reason they didn't have the courage to, or they wanted to be cruel. So instead of shooting them, they just kept walking them in the snow until they all died. So it's things like this that the fact that you and I dodged these bullets and that we can be here and be doing this and running our mouths for a living. I think about it all the time, and it's just very uh, disturbing to know. And I know you know this as well, that there's lots of places on Earth where if people had a choice, they would kill us on sight and be proud of themselves for it.
Yeah, there. I don't know what to make of the contrast. You were talking about the fact that you've been truly happy the last few weeks and months.
Yes.
There's been a lot of moments of happiness and joy, and that joy is built on a history of human suffering. Like in your roots, in your blood, is a lot of people that were tortured, that suffered, so that you could have this joy. And you have the responsibility to truly be grateful for that joy.
But it also shows that there's the happy ending, that it does end in a good note, that it does get infinitely, infinitely better. And that I think I don't like using the word responsibility, but there is an opportunity for those of us who did dodge that bullet to give testimony to these people, and more importantly, to give testimony to the people who are going through this now. So, one of the reasons I, talk about North Korea so much, why I wrote Dear Reader, is because it's very easy, and this is human nature. I'm not condemning people. I think that's just how people are wired. When you see an Asian country with Asian people and things are, bad over there, I think in the West, it's like, oh, Asia, they're all crazy there. They're wacky. They eat, they eat dogs or so on and so forth, some weird stereotype. And they think of them as kind of Martians. So it's important for people who aren't of that kind of ancestry to kind of speak on behalf of these people, because it's very different how just people just naturally react when you have a Westerner talking about this. Instead of it becoming them over there, it becomes, this could have been us very easily. I have a friend, Peter Vehansky, great dude. And I was showing him photos when I was in Pyongyang, and he goes, this looks like a Russian city with Asian people. It completely disturbed him. So, that was one of the reasons I did go to North Korea, because that was as close as I would get to see what your family went through, to see what my family went through. And they're still living under this a regime. And one of the things I fought very hard to do with Dear Reader, which I was successful in amazingly, and I said, like, I could die now. Like, I feel like if you just move the needle a little bit, then you've kind of paid your due for your time here on this earth. To have it change from being a laughing stock, and I think Team America did a good job. They made Kim Jong-il into a clown and they made a joke of it, but you're going from nothing to joke. So at least now people are aware of it, that it exists, right? And then and many others took it from a joke to like, guys, this is really, really, really bad. And none of us can even appreciate how bad it is. And I think now there is an understanding, other than a few people who are just looking at it through a Trump lens and wanting Trump to fail because Trump's an asshole, and that's fine, to be like, these poor people. And it's really unfortunate because there's a segment of Western culture who thinks that correctly. Often when you're complaining about or discussing the plight of another country, that's just your prelude to war and an excuse to invade. Like the Kurds in Syria, we're talked about, if we're not in Syria tomorrow, it's going to be another genocide, blah, blah. I'm not saying let's invade North Korea or anything like that. All I'm saying is, thank God that this isn't your life. I bring this up all the time. The woman who was my guide when I was there, I'm aware of what she's up to now. She's extremely rich by North Korean standards, but she'll never be in a position to buy medicine. She'll never be in a position to go on a vacation. Things that you and I just, whatever. She can't go on the internet. She can't get an encyclopedia. She can't better herself as a person other than through what the state allows, and meaning better yourself as a person in service to the state. So, I mean, it's also frustrating because there's only so much that I can do as an individual.
What's your takeaway about human nature from looking at North Korea and looking at how the rest of the world is looking at North Korea?
I always, this is a great question. I think about it fairly often. And I always say human beings are animals, right? When you say someone's an animal, it's like a slur, like he's like a beast. Animals are capable of enormous kindness empathy, sympathy. They look out for one another, groom one another. There's a thing with apes where they groom each other for parasites, and you're supposed, even if there are no parasites, they pretend that there's parasites just to have that kind of bonding. You see infinite photos online of like cats raising puppies because the puppy's mom died, things like this. That's part of being an animal. Part of being an animal is also just the most monstrous cruelty. Killer whales, there's this big PC move to not call them killer whales and just call them orcas. They will murder blue whale calves, excuse me, and play with them and not even eat them. So they just murder for the sake of fun. So there's and cats, kill birds all the time, things like this. So it runs the whole gamut. And I think I'm, when Yaron and I were on your show, I don't think Lord of the Flies is accurate. I don't think Hobbes is how reality works when you're in that kind of state. But I think we've seen countless examples of human beings, especially when human beings have power over someone who's powerless, of allowing themselves to engage in not just harm, but cruelty. And that is something, as Soviets, you and I are very painfully aware of. That it's not just about the oppression, which is bad enough as it is. It's that mediocre person with that little bit of power. And now they're standing between you and your daughter having medicine, and they love it to make you dance, to be like, oh, you need me to get this medicine? Make you go through hoops? Because now they feel like for the first time in their life, they're in a position of strength and power. I think that is, in many ways, the more common nature of evil. What Hannah Arendt talks about, the banality of evil, than someone who's like an SS guard just shooting someone in the head. Like that, I think we could all wrap our heads around to some extent. Like, okay, I'm a military. It's not easy. I have to execute people. Pulling a trigger, you could kind of have this mental disconnect between the finger and the victim. But like that little day-to-day stuff, like, are you doing the right thing on a day-to-day basis? That I think is far more common and far more disturbing aspect in certain senses of the human psyche.
Yeah, there's something especially disturbing about a weak man given power and just abusing that power. There's something about not just weak, but like mediocre at everything he does, or less than mediocre.
A great example of this, which I'm also talking about in the next book, is Ceausescu, who was the dictator of Romania. So, the Cold War is still somewhat poorly understood in popular culture, but the different countries in the Second World, the Soviet bloc, some were more liberal than others. Some were more sane than others. And Ceausescu at first was one of the, more Western friendly, more the free ones. Then he met the great leader Kim Il-sung from North Korea, and he had the idea to impose a personality cult on Romania. And it's the kind of things like forcing people to breed because he wanted to make people taller. I think he made like the biggest building in all of Europe, the People's Palace, but it was just for him while there's no electricity, elsewhere. But you look at this guy, Stalin's a badass, right? He was a bank robber. If you look at photos of him as a kid, he was a hunk. Lenin was clearly intellectual. These were powerful. Trotsky, these were powerful men with huge egos, huge force of personality. But you look at this Ceausescu guy, and you could, like, for example, on my driver's license, instead of my address, I'm like in my real address, being like 1234 Fifth Avenue. By mistake, it says 1234 Fifth Street, right? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine him being in the post office and me giving him my ID to get my package, and him being baffled because this says street, this says avenue, instead of understand. And the look on his face, this dullard, that you can see how, how sometimes can I curse?
Fuck yes.
Yeah. So if like how if you're in the airport and you see someone and you look at them, an adult, and you think, okay, this person was born fucked up, just like on sight, like something's wrong with them. How are they traveling alone? You look at Ceausescu, you look at him, you're like, something's not right with this guy. Not in the sense of like evil, but in the sense of he's a simpleton, right? And now he's in charge of this whole country, and everyone's taught to regard him as one of the great geniuses of all time. And it's this, the idea of this mediocre nobody. This guy would have, in any other culture, been accomplished nothing, or would have had an honest job where he's like, okay, he works at the mail service and he's bad at it. Okay, fine, he's not hurting anyone. And now as a result of this, he's responsible for mass death, secret police, and incarceration. And, one of the greatest things that I've ever seen, which I'm sure many people have seen as well, if you go on YouTube, it's his speech And it's the first time the crowd turns and his head kind of like, because they start booing him, which was unheard of. And, he was shot with his dog-faced wife not that long after. It was just a great moment. But it's things like this. I agree with you that mediocre, weak person is now in a position of power over somebody else. And that sense of vindictiveness, like I'm going to feel strong for once in my life, but it's going to be at your expense. That I think is, human nature. It's most primal.
And every time I meet a person in this world,
You're the first person to get me to cry on a fucking podcast. Fucking the robot gets me to cry. What the fuck is going on?